Welcome to Thrive Deeper, an ongoing conversation with Dr. Matthew Jacoby, author of the Thrive Bible Reading Guides, teaching pastor and leader of the Psalmist band Sons of Korah. Join us as we go deeper into the Bible, discussing the passages as we read them together with Thrive. Now here's your host, DJ Paine.
G'day and welcome. It's DJ Paine here, and welcome to episode 2 of Thrive Deeper, the podcast, the show where we take you deeper into the readings that we're doing in the Thrive Reading Guide. Now, this week's discussion with Matt Jacoby is going deeper into the book of Ezekiel. We talk about things like the recognition formula. Have you ever heard of that one? The recognition formula. What is it? What does it mean? And also a little bit about the name of God. Who is He? And what does that mean to us? One of my favorite parts of this conversation is when we got into the nitty-gritty of how God actually spoke and gave visions to Ezekiel and how Ezekiel gave them to us and how we have them today. I really enjoyed it, and I know you will too. So without further ado, after the break, join me and Matt having a discussion, and you'll enjoy how Matt realizes how this podcast is going to continue and how the opening will work. It's a little bit behind the scenes, but I know you'll enjoy it. All right, I'll talk to you after the conversation.
In chapter 33, Ezekiel receives the announcement, Jerusalem's fallen. And then it's like, chink, straight away, his whole tone changes to now that there's hope. Right up to that point, it's just so I think it's worth stating that up to chapter 33, it's oracles of judgment. He's convicting these people, but as soon as the judgment is executed on the nation and the city is destroyed, that's about the bottom of the barrel.
Okay, good.
That's about as bad as they can imagine it getting. Yeah. And then it's all about building them up.
Okay, great.
And
That's a good overall theme.
Yeah.
So I've already started the recording going.
Well, we're recording.
Yeah, we're already.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, we're already recording. We don't do the intros like we used to. The intros are all different now. So it just sort of gradually, the conversation between you and me just gradually fades in.
Okay.
All right. So immediately I can see the hat go on for you. As you've just come back from Europe.
Yeah.
How long you been back for?
Been back for a week and a half, I think.
Yeah. Do you feel like it was a dream, or do you feel like
it always feels like a dream? Yeah. Particularly when it's in another country, but it's good to be back, and it's good to be getting back into things. Actually, I had this great moment in the aeroplane where I was flying. I was reading Ezekiel, and I'm really getting into it.
Great.
And it's just speaking to my heart, and I'm imagining, Ezekiel there with the exiles in Babylon, and the situation there in Babylon. And I look at the flight path, on the plane, and I think, hang on a minute. And I pulled up the window thing. I looked out, it's a perfectly clear day. We're flying over old Babylon. Like, we're literally flying over, like, Baghdad, because old Babylon now is just outside of Baghdad.
Wow.
And I could see the river and everything. And I'm reading this, and we're flying over. It was an amazing moment of convergence. It was beautiful.
Were you like, I've got God's eye view of what was going on?
Yeah.
This is fantastic.
Which is great because Ezekiel is God's eye view on what was going on. Oh, it was just a classic moment.
That is fantastic. So last in episode 1, kicking off Thrive Deeper, we covered, we introduced Ezekiel, we introduced all the circumstances there.
Yeah.
So go back and have a listen to that one if you haven't had a listen. But now we're sort of, cruising into Ezekiel chapter 5. And for this first sort of, not really half, but the first main part of the book, it's all very doom and gloom.
Yeah. Right up until chapter 33, we are pre-586 BC. Now, the significance of that is that in 586 BC, that's like the last stroke of judgment.
Yeah.
When the city is destroyed.
Bang.
There's that rebellion under Zedekiah, and Nebuchadnezzar comes back, lays siege to the city. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible siege.
And it's not like a siege, not in our minds, in our like movie way of thinking of modern times. It's not a siege that happens in a week.
No.
It's not a siege that happens in a month.
A couple of years.
Yeah.
So And the people are starved within, and finally they break through, and it's just an absolute bloodbath, because after a siege, a siege is going to make an army angry, because they've got a camp there.
And the reason why it went that long is because the people in Israel, the Jewish people, were holding out. They were fighting back.
The people of Judah, yeah. So finally they break through, and it's an absolute bloodbath. Now the announcement comes to Ezekiel. We read about this in Ezekiel chapter 33. And the interesting thing is, from that moment, the tone changes. Up to that moment, he's trying to get the people to own where they're at and what they've done, and to take responsibility. But as soon as that last stroke of judgment occurs, which is about the bottom of the barrel, that is the bottom out point for this nation, because they never would have imagined that such a thing could ever happen, that the temple in this city, this so-called invulnerable city, could be destroyed.
Would you call that the darkest day?
Yeah,
in the Old Testament, Testament history.
Certainly after sort of Genesis chapter 12, when the real sort of story of the Bible begins at close quarters, it is the darkest day, and it's the bottom out point where everything is lost. And from that moment, the tone changes. It's remarkable in Ezekiel. The tone changes, and it's then oracles of hope and restoration and looking towards the future. So he stripped them back to get them back to one key realization, really. And right up to that point, it's quite dark. He's wanting them to face and take responsibility for their rebellion. And that happens right up to chapter 33. So that's where we are. And really the one thing that he's trying to get them back to, and I think this is the first, big theme, I think that unites the whole book of Ezekiel, that's worth saying something about. The one thing that God is prepared to sacrifice everything for, like everything else can be lost. We could just, city destroyed, temple destroyed, people brought into exile. You think, what's left, right? He's stripping things back. What could possibly warrant this kind of disaster and tragedy? Well, this is where you get this repeated thing. There is one thing that God wants these people to realize, and it is simply, this is painfully simple, but is simply the fact that He is God. It's to bring them back to this simple realization. Now, throughout the book of Ezekiel, more times than I have been able to count, there is this repeated statement. It's known as the recognition formula. It simply says, and then they will know that I am the Lord. And it says this, it's throughout everything that God does. Interestingly, whether acts of judgment or acts of restoration, the rationale that's given for that is, and then they will know that I am God.
Now, that's not just let's break that down a little bit. That what did you call it? The restoration?
The recognition formula.
Recognition formula?
Yeah.
Recognition formula. Let's break that down. It's not just a head knowledge.
No.
Because they're fighting and keeping, the temple going and everything like that in the name of God, and saying that we are God's people and everything like that. What does this mean? What is God calling them to actually do?
To know that God is essentially the same thing as letting God be God. I mean, letting sounds, that sounds silly to say that we should let God be. But there is an element in that we have a choice here, as to whether we will acknowledge God as God or not. So, it's a knowledge, it's a much more experiential knowledge. It's a matter not of just of the head of knowing that God is God, in that sense, but knowing, in a, like really acknowledging and realizing and letting God be God over our situation. So, in a sense, he's saying, then you will realize that I am God, right? And it's this life-changing experiential, realization. Now, the interesting thing is that it says that in lots of different contexts. So, for example, it's oracles of judgment. You know, I'm going to strip you down. I'm going to strip things down bare, and I'm going to bring judgment, and the sword is going to come, and it's going to, and all of these calamities. And then it says, and then you will know that I'm God. So what we picture there is God stripping everything back so that all that they have actually is him. And, you know, there's a saying that I have often used at church, you know, that sometimes you don't know that God is all that you need until God is all that you have.
Yeah.
And that's an example of realizing that God is God, because God actually is ultimately all that we need. And sometimes we don't realize that until God is all that we have. And then you get the other context where there are these oracles about the nations, and all of these oracles of judgment against the nations, where he's going to take Egypt and he's going to tear them down. You know, he's going to cause them to fall from their high position. And then it even says of them, and then they will know that I am God.
Wow.
So it's not just Israel that God's concerned about.
Yeah.
It's not just Israel. He wants all of the nations to know that he is God, and he is going to pull them down from their godlike position. And what is evident in the oracles of the nations, the sort of common charge, particularly when it comes to Tyre and Egypt, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, is that he blames them for claiming to be like God.
Yeah.
And he's going to rip them down. And then he says, and then you will know that I am God. In other words, and not you.
So there can be a sense of both judgment and peace about it.
Yeah, that's right. So whether through God's kindness or whether through acts of judgment, the goal, the rationale throughout the book of Ezekiel is then you will know that I'm God. So actually, it shows that God does things not just to get his own back or no, it's so that they will know. The most important fact in the universe is that, you know, that we acknowledge God as God, you know, that every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, because he embodies the godship of God, you know, the deity and the kingship of God. So this is interesting because, it also makes sense of another theme that comes out where
that's about God's name.
Yeah, about God's name.
Okay.
And there are moments where he says, look, all of these things that I'm going to do, I'm doing for the sake of my name. In fact, in Ezekiel 36, he says, therefore say to the Israelites, this is from verse 22, this is what the sovereign Lord says, it is not for your sake, people of Israel, that I'm going to do these things, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you have gone. I will show the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, the name you have profaned among them. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord. So it sounds like, I mean, at one glance, sounds like God's, you know, just concerned, like selfishly concerned about his own reputation.
Yeah.
But actually, it comes out of this desire of God for everyone to know who he is. Because the most important thing for human beings, the thing that determines our life is how we see God. How we live and whether we live a fruitful and full life depends on how we see God and whether we know that God is God. So God wants everyone everywhere to know that he is God. And he shows himself through his people. This is the role of Israel, was to be the vehicle through which God shows himself, as it were, to the rest of the world. Now, this is the problem. When Israel, as the charge is often brought in the book of Ezekiel, he says again and again, you have become worse than the nations around you. Yeah. And that's a big problem because they were meant to be the ones who actually reflected God to the nations. Yeah. They were meant to be a light to the Gentiles. You've heard that
like
idea.
Their very lives and the way that they conducted themselves and the blessings that they had that God was bestowing them, that was the message.
Yeah. So they were to embody not only... And because sometimes we think, it's just in terms of their obedience and they would exhibit God's character. Well, no, not even just that. Actually, it was God's faithfulness to his covenant promises being fulfilled among them in his blessing, you know, by which God would reveal himself. Now, that would happen. God's saying in Ezekiel 36 there, when we're jumping ahead here, but this is a theme that we also find early in these earlier chapters. He says, I'm going to do these good things to you, even though you don't deserve. When he says it's not for your sake, he means it's not because you've been so good and I'm blessing you.
Yes.
And actually in chapter 20, it says that explicitly. It's not, this is your acts haven't warranted, I'm not going to treat you on the basis of your acts, but on the basis of my faithfulness, actually. Because God is saying, I am going to show myself faithful through you one way or the other, and it is. And
by that you mean by judgment or by
blessing.
That's
right. Yeah. Because there are also these warnings of judgment on them. So really, for better or for worse, interesting that one way or the other, they would embody the message. So, for example, in chapter 5, verse 15, God says, you will be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and an object of horror to the nations around you when I inflict punishment on you in anger and in wrath and with stinging rebuke.
Wow.
It's so they are going to, the nations are going to look at them and they are going to stand as a warning to the nations. So whether for better or for worse, for Israel, for the people of Judah at this stage we're talking about, they are going to embody the message of God.
Now that judgment that's very explicit right there in the verse you just read out, that was fulfilled by the Babylonians.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So in a sense, that final destruction of the city is the end, is the fall of the curtain on these judgments, and even in that, God shows his faithfulness to things that he said would happen. Yeah. Because it vindicates the predictions of Ezekiel and Isaiah and, throughout this book, God is showing himself to be God, but not only God, to show himself to be the Lord. Now, that's the important thing too.
Okay.
It's
differentiate the two for us. What's the difference between God and the Lord?
That's right. So when you read in your English translations, you'll read the name of God, the personal name of God, the Lord. Now this,
some will be in all caps.
It'll be whenever it's in all caps, it is the Hebrew word underneath it is actually just the consonants. Why, it's Yahweh, basically. Just in Hebrew consonants. They didn't, so we don't know exactly how to say it because they never added the vowels. Now, this is the personal name that God gave to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. I'm giving you my personal name because I'm entering into a personal relationship with this nation and I'm giving them my name. And the name stands for, it's God as the covenant God, the God who has bound himself to his people and made certain promises and has committed himself to a plan. So when, now, it's interesting. Some people might wonder, well, then why not put Yahweh there? Why do we put the Lord? Because that's a title, not a name. Well, this actually comes from, it's a long story and I'll give you the nutshell version. But in the sort of 200s BC, a Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, was made. And by the Greek emperor at the time, it was commissioned, and so there were 70. So the story goes, 70 Jewish scribes that set about making a Greek translation. Now, the abbreviation for often when it became known as the Septuagint, and it's often abbreviated LXX, which simply means 70, sept, 7. Because of these 70 elders that translated this. Now, they had these scruples about translating the name of God. There's scruples around the commandment not to take the Lord's name in vain. So they thought, well, we won't use it at all. And so they just put, they just put the Greek word kurios in there to Lord. And so that has carried through to this day. so that even in most English translations to this day, we still use the word Lord.
There's a great video.
There's a big footnote.
Yeah, there's a big footnote. And asterisk next to that footnote, there's a great video from the Bible Project team about this very concept.
Right.
Why we use that word and how it was how the Jews did it.
Great resource.
And so we'll put a link somewhere where you can find that pretty easy. But if not, look up the Bible Project. A fantastic resource.
So that underscores this idea that God, and I think we can seal off this theme because it is a major theme in Ezekiel, that everything that God does is explained under the rationale that they will know that I am the Lord their God.
Okay. Now, on the ongoing part of that story, there are steps towards this darker state.
Yeah.
And Ezekiel is seeing visions and experience them in different ways. One of the first big ones that happened is this, and we hear it quoted, and it's almost become for some circles in the church a bit of a catchphrase for certain things. It's the glory has departed.
Yeah. It's a tragic vision in one sense, because the glory of God that we read entered the temple during the time of Solomon, and inhabited his temple. God with his people. I mean, this is such a key idea, such a key part of God's purposes. This idea to be in the midst of his people, and the temple was the symbol of that. First of all, the tabernacle, then the temple. And God inhabited, his tabernacle and his temple. We get this tragic event in Ezekiel 10 where we see this vision of the glory of the Lord departing. Now, he's actually moving east. So in one sense, he's not really departing his people. He's actually going to be with them in their exile.
Yeah.
But he's departing from his temple. And even there's a tragedy around that because they had profaned the holy city and the holy temple to the point where God departs. But there's hope in that vision in the sense that he's going to be with his people in exile. And it's actually in exile that they're going to experience an amazing renewal, actually, largely as a result of the ministry of Ezekiel and Daniel.
Now, when you read through that part of Ezekiel where he sees the, the glory departing, do you take? I mean, it's a vision.
Yeah.
Is that now? When we read that, do we take that as a dream, or is he seeing something reality in a spiritual realm that we can't see, or is he being transported there physically? What because there's so many different ways. And Ezekiel's he doesn't sort of give us the same pattern all the time of what he sees.
Yeah.
And he describes it in different ways of how do you read it?
Well, he speaks about being in the spirit and being taken to, and it's clear from chapter 8 and 9 that it is a vision that he's seeing. It isn't, or
is it too phenomenal to even work out?
Maybe that's too limiting. But look, we can certainly say it is a vision.
Yes.
And he is taken there in some sense, and he's seeing things the way that God sees things. So there is a reality within that vision as well.
Lots of questions.
And of course, what underscores it as a vision as well is the fact that God is portrayed in highly symbolic terms. So he is seeing, it's a vision in that sense, that he's seeing things that are filtered in a way to him, in a way that he's able to grasp somehow.
So in your comprehension, we're going a little bit down the rabbit trail now, but this is what I love about it, is do you think the filtering that he sees, this is getting really, we're getting down to scruples now, do you think that the scruples, the way that the filter that it's in, is that before it hits him, or is it his mind that it's filtering? Because he can't take it all in. It's like if you showed a primitive person something they'd never seen before, or a colour they hadn't seen before, they would recognise it as something else in their terms.
Yeah. I would say it comes to him like that.
Okay.
Because I would want to say that the origin of these revelations is God. God is the origin of these revelations.
Great answer. Love it. Love it. Great answer. Okay. Now, moving through, he sees the glory depart. Ezekiel sees the glory depart. And then we get a repeated sort of theme, and this theme is elsewhere in the Old Testament of, the picture of marriage.
Yeah.
And this one is pretty full on.
Yeah. In Ezekiel 16, you get that allegory of the unfaithful wife, and it's this. It begins with Israel as a child wallowing in its blood, like being abandoned, which is a powerful imagery. It's a little foreign to us because in the ancient world they practiced children would be cast off. So if you had a child that was disabled in some way, or sometimes even not the gender that you wanted, you would take the child from its birth, from the moment of birth, and you would put it out on the mountainside and leave it to die. And basically in Ezekiel 16, God is using that imagery that they were familiar with and quite disturbing in some ways. And he's saying to Israel, this was you, actually. You were that child.
Unwanted.
Yeah, in a sort of spiritual sense, that was who you were. And I came along and I adopted you.
Almost, to be horrible about it, they're like a post-birth abortion.
Yeah.
Type of thing. It's funny, you just reminded me when I was in, and this is, you say way back then.
Yeah.
I was I was blessed to be in the Philippines in the 90s on a mission trip in the jungle. And when I was there, it had only been about, between 10 to 15 years since this particular tribe in the jungle had heard the gospel for the first time and sort of gotten civilization, if you know what I mean. And I was able to sit down, even though we didn't speak the same language, but through translators, talk to some of the elders of the church in that particular jungle. And one of the elders, one of the higher elders, came from the family of witch doctors.
Yeah.
He practiced, dark spiritual stuff. And he was very candid and open and honest and knew what he said. And one of the things that he illustrated of why he was so thankful for the gospel coming to them and the education that he received, he said, we believed that a twin was a demon. The second born was an imitation of the first. Right. So we would take the imitation and place it in the jungle for the wild animals to eat.
Oh, shivers.
And
it's terrible.
Yeah, and that exactly what you were saying.
This is what was happening flat out.
And you were saying it so long ago. It's probably still happening today in the reaches. Look,
it was common practice right into the New Testament. One of the from the early church correspondence, we know that it was actually really one of the countercultural things about the early church was the fact they didn't practice exposure of children. They didn't practice infanticide.
Wow.
And this meant that actually the populations of Christians actually were going up when the rest of the population was actually decreasing.
Wow.
But so this is the world that these people lived in, and this is a very powerful imagery for this time. And God's saying, I adopted you, I picked you off the ground, and I adorned you. Like I made you everything that you are. Don't you forget it. This is such a powerful picture for our lives, because God makes us everything that we are, but then, with all of our strengths and we turn that to independence. We say, by God, we'll be right from here, and we go off and essentially this is what Israel did. They got to this point of strength and then it was...
Yeah, we'll take it from here.
Yeah, we'll take it from here. And not only that, but part of their turning away from God was turning to these other gods, and so you get this theme of adultery, which is the most common metaphor used for idolatry. And the reason was because it was the perfect analogy because of the marriage covenant. Marriage was seen as a covenant, and God had made a covenant with His people, and Israel broke the marriage covenant, and so the marriage illustration has that covenant aspect, but it also has that intensely personal aspect. This isn't just a business agreement, God's saying, that you and I have. It's not like you've just broken a business agreement. You have broken my heart. You know, it underscores the personal nature of this relationship between God and his people. And it underscores the fact that this isn't God just cranky that he didn't get his way out of some business transaction. No, this is the infinite creator God whose heart has been rent by the unfaithfulness of his people. You know, there's mixing of metaphors, obviously, because in reality, we are God's children. And yet whenever to describe his relationship, often, the marriage covenant is the picture that is used because of the covenant element, there. Yeah.
And that echoes the marriage covenant that is spoken about, you know, for us as the church.
That's
as well.
Right. Yeah. So that metaphor is brought through to us being the bride of Christ, because again, and the importance of that, with its roots in the Old Testament, is that it has this covenant aspect. We have this covenant relationship with God through Christ.
Some powerful imagery there from the book of Ezekiel about the marriage between God and Israel and how that transfers onto us. I hope you were able to hear there a few light bulb moments for myself as Matt and I were getting into it, especially about how the visions of Ezekiel worked and how God relayed that to him. I really made sense to me. I hope it made sense to you. But maybe you've got a question, or you've got an idea, or you've got a different interpretation. We would love to hear from you. In a moment, Benita, the wonderful voiceover lady, is going to come on and tell you how you can find us. But we're hoping that as you dig through Thrive, as you go through the daily readings, you'll be writing down your ideas, jotting them down. We would love to hear from you. Even if it's about something fantastic that you've been learning, it doesn't have to be a question. Whatever it is, please get in contact with us, whether through the website or the Facebook page. We'd love to hear from you. Well, until next time, this has been DJ Paine for Thrive. We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to Thrive Deeper. If you have questions you would like answered, contact us on Facebook at facebook.com/thrivedeeper or at the Thrive Today website, where you can also subscribe to the Thrive Daily Bible Reading Guide. That's at thrivetoday.net.au. Until next time, thrive.